Stephen Phillips Trust Home is located on historic Chestnut Street in Salem, Massachusetts, known as one of the most beautiful streets in America. The Phillips home is the only home still open to the public and shows a representation of 5 generations of the Phillipses' extensive travels and riches. In 1873, the American Revolution ended and the Treaty of Paris was signed between Britain and the United States. One of the terms recognized the U.S. as their own country. However, a non-treaty result was that both Britain and America lost each other as major trading partners. After this, Britain used China as their major trading partner and tried to prevent the U.S. from having a direct route with China, making the U.S. want to secure profits with China even more. Majority of the 13 colonies started looking west for help and to secure land, but one man looked to the east of China and knew that the U.S. needed to boost their economy. They needed to provide employment for the colonists who had depended on the sea their entire lives so that they could continue to manufacture and import goods and generate a new kind of American foreign trade. And to do this, they needed China because they had a direct route. China trade officially began on February 22, 1784, with the voyage of Robert Morris's boat, Empress of China, a boat carrying 2,600 animal skins, fine camel cloth, cotton, a few barrels of pepper, and 30 tons of ginseng, a wild root that the Chinese believed had intensive healing powers. The ship left Philadelphia and went down and around the tip of Africa, arriving in China 6 months later, the first American ship to ever be seen at the port of Canton. The items were traded in Canton, and then the boat returned back to the U.S. Both the U.S. and China profited. They were able to get rid of their surplus, import new items, and spread their culture. The currency around the world was different for every country at the time, so buying items was very hard, so trade was perfect. From then on out, trade skyrocketed between the U.S. and China. The Chinese referred to the Americans as new people because they were used to the Europeans being in China all the time. They also referred to them as foreign devils, as they called every country that tried to trade with them. Trading with China was very lucrative for the U.S., and soon enough they got a good foothold in the ports of Macau and Canton. Selling U.S. goods to China was very profitable, but selling Chinese goods to America was even more profitable because the people of America didn't have to go to China themselves but could get all the wonders of China from others who went. America boosted their economy vastly through trade. One man by the name of Elias Haskett Derby was the first American self-made millionaire, making all his money off the China sea trade. He was born in Salem on August 16, 1739, and was the first owner and generation of the Stephen Phillips house, which was first located in Danvers. His father, Richard Derby, was a successful bookkeeper, sea captain, and merchant. By 1760, his father had 13 vessels engaged in West Indian and Southern Atlantic trade. As a young man, Derby was equipping privateers and had a share or owned half of the 150 privateers that went in and out of Salem. Derby got rich off these little privateers, but his biggest privateer, the Grand Turk, made the most income and became Salem's most successful privateer, being 300 tons and designed for speed, endurance, capacity, had 28 guns and a copper bottom, made in Hanover, Massachusetts by Thomas Barstow. Derby paid for the boat by bartering with goods like rum and butter exchanged for materials and labor. 5 boats, including the Grand Turk, were launched in May of 1781, arriving in China in 1766, and arrived back to Salem May 22, 1787, becoming the first New England ships to trade with China. Derby was very optimistic about trade with China at first because he was doing very well. In 1789, at least 16 American vessels were in Canton, 4 of them being Derby's. But barely 3 years after the start of the American-China trade, the market's excess trade, the cost of doing business with China, and the length of the ship's voyage undermined profits a lot. In 1790, the last of his ships returned from Canton, and he never sent another one. Instead, he sent them to the Isle of France, Batavia, Sumatra, India, Europe, West Indies, and the Atlantic Islands. It was perfect timing when Derby stopped sending ships to Canton because problems with China trade began to arise. China wanted as few foreigners as possible in their country because they feared even more that the Westerners would corrupt and try to conquer China. Sea trade was boosting China's economy immensely, but they needed new rules for trade to help secure their country. In 1760, the government created a set of regulations to control foreigners and their ships, which they called the Canton System, and it remained intact until 1842, when an Opium War treaty disowned the system. The Canton System was very strict in how and where the world could trade with China. First, all trade ships had to have written permission, a chop, to even go into Chinese waters, and were then required to stop at Macau, a small settlement acquired by the Portuguese 40 miles from Hong Kong and 65 miles south of Canton. After the ship was examined and approved, the ship would proceed to Wampao, an island 13 miles south of Canton, where it remained docked. Here, the captain and the unloaded cargo would get transported up the river to Canton, where it would stay for the trading season, August through March. No guns or arms of any sort could be brought into Canton, not even for trade. If women came on the ship, they stayed in Macau, setting up housekeeping where they waited for the end of the season for their husbands. Factories were named by the country who established it first and were outside of the Canton on the Pearl River. Goods were stored on the first floor, and housed offices and accommodations were on the second and third floors. Derby, who passed away on September 8, 1799, is now referred to as King Derby because of his millionaire successes through the China sea trade. Derby was the first of the 5 generations to own the Phillips house, but it was originally located in Danvers, where Derby grew up. It wasn't until 1821 that 4 of the rooms were moved to Chestnut Street, Salem, Massachusetts by Captain Nathaniel West, who added on to what was the Derbys. The 4 rooms are in the front of the home and are the oldest part of the home. The next generations added a room or so and had a lot of money from their own successes, such as being the first mayor of Massachusetts and a successful shipbuilder. Because of this, they made a hobby of collecting artifacts from around the world for folks back home and to decorate and show it off in their home. In 1911, Stephen W. Phillips bought the home for 1 cent and created a museum of the 5 generations artifacts to show the extensive travels and riches of the Phillipses to future generations.